Today on Jurassic Architect, we get stuck in with our first enclosure. Hello and welcome back to Tricolor Gaming with me, Fletcher. And welcome back to my build along Jurassic Architect Park here on the UK map. Now, last video we were looking at how to construct entrance areas and go through sort of basic decorative work, basic plaza building, picking your initial buildings, that sort of thing. You can see here that I haven't touched this area at all. That's because I'm leaving it for a future video. But today's video is going to be all about your starting enclosure. And as you can see here, I've already constructed the basic perimeter of that enclosure. Initially, I was going to construct a lagoon here, but I've decided against it. Instead, I wanted to sort of go through with you guys the basic enclosure designing tactics and techniques. The first thing I would say that people need to do when they're designing enclosures is to figure out what they want the enclosure to do. So the idea for this is that this is going to be the first enclosure that people sort of come off the bridge that's going to be here, and this is going to be the first one they see, and it's also sort of a roundabout. This is a sort of central area which is then going to lead to the tour ride. It's then going to lead further down here where we have more enclosures. So I wanted this one to be either a circle or octagon, and you can see I've gone for a slightly imperfect octagon down here, and we're going to put the enclosure in the center. So basically people are going to be walking around it. Now, constructing something like this is relatively easy. I'm going to show you guys how to do it. This is 14 minimum path lengths in diameter, but I'll do a more simple one over here so you guys can see how simple it is. In this case, I'm going to go up by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's 6 minimum lengths long. So we're going to pick the middle point, which is 3. So 1, 2, 1, 2, and 3. So you have a cross. Then from here, we're going to go out and do diagonals of also 3. And then from there, all you need to do is join up the ends in whatever way you like. If you want an octagon, do straight lines. If you want a circle, do curved lines. So like I say, this is 14 minimum path lengths in width and length, and then I've added an extra one on top so we can double the path around it. Once you've got your relative shape of your enclosure, for something like this, we want to sort of think about what we're going to have on the inside. So I don't want any animal that's going to be particularly dangerous here. So what I'm going to do is not use any fencing around this at all. What we're going to do is we're going to sink the terrain in slightly. Now, if you are going to sink the terrain in and create what I call a well enclosure, you want to make sure that it's on perfect water height, which this is, and then we're going to just extend all the way out to the edges. Now, I'm not going to surround the edges in fencing because I want this one to be the sort of enclosure where people could sort of peer over the edge of the wall, as it were, and have a look inside. So around this, we're going to use the wall pieces to create that perimeter. Yeah, we're going to need to place a fair few of them. Now, obviously, with mods, you can get them really close together, but even without mods, you can see, if I just zoom in there, like, so that's how close I can get them using mods, but you should be able to get them that close if you're not using mods. You know, that's not bringing up the fact that it's overlapping at all. So, now obviously this is going to take some time to build the perimeter wall around the outer edge. So I'm going to fast forward while I finish this, and I'll see you in a second when it's done. So there we go. The whole thing surrounded by the basic fence or a basic wall. to give you that illusion that this is the sort of enclosure you're going to be able to look down into. Now, to ensure that no dinosaurs escape, we're going to surround it with invisible fencing. Now, if you're not playing with all eras on, or if you don't have the bias in DLC, or if you can't play with all eras on, I would suggest you use another type of fence for this, but one that's not particularly too offensive, such as like thin fencing, because you could still see relatively through that. But the invisible fencing works well for this, and that creates your actual perimeter. And then we can get on with the task of decorating and designing the enclosure. So for these edges, I'm going to make them quite rocky, because it makes sense. And we're going to think about where we're going to want to put the water. Now, given the sort of fact that this end is not particularly perfect with the rest of it, I'm going to put the water down here. I'm going to want to try and get it as close to the edges as possible. That should be enough water for the animals that we're kind of wanting to put in here. You might also want to think about, at this point, like what animal you're actually putting in here. If you're putting in a carnivore, you're obviously going to want to think about if you're putting in a herbivore, it obviously doesn't matter sort of what vegetation and stuff you put in here. But if you're putting herbivores in here and you do have feeding on, which I always do, you're obviously going to want to think about sort of where you're going to position trees and plants and that sort of thing. Now, once you have the basics of the enclosure set up, then it comes time for hardcore. Now, hardcore is rocks, trees, that sort of thing, anything big and chunky. I'm going to put down plenty of rocks, and I'm going to utilize the Taiga rocks. I find the Taiga rocks particularly satisfying to use, and I am, in this point, going to take full advantage of free build in order to place rocks over the fencing. If you're not using mods or can't use mods, obviously you can't do that, but there are other ways that you can use to hide. Even if you just like put rocks either side of the fence, that can work to hide them too. But the whole purpose of hardscaping is the same whether you're using mods or not using mods. The purpose is to just give the enclosure some extra sort of detail. We're also going to put, so something I think people tend to forget to do is to place things like rocks, not just at the edges of their enclosures, but also in the middles. We've got quite a lot of empty space here, and a couple of rocks can just help make the space look a little more interesting. Once you've put your hardscape in, then it comes time for things like vegetation. I would always suggest manually placing vegetation to begin with, and thinking about what types of vegetation you want to use. We have a lot of vegetation that we can use in these parks, and it comes in all sorts of different sizes and shapes. I would always suggest that the first sort of trees you think about placing are the biggest ones. And I would suggest that you don't place too many of them. In an enclosure this sort of size, we don't really want to place too many because that'll spoil the view of the animals. So I'm going to start by picking just a couple of the European taller trees. And again, I'm not going to overlap these, so you can see the sorts of things you can do without mods. I'm going to place smaller trees around the bigger ones to create some differences in height. And I'm also going to continue using the orange and red trees to create some different color. But again, I'm not going to use too many of the bigger trees. Probably the one type of vegetation you're going to use the most are things like bushes, whether it's the big bush or the little bush. They can really help to bed in your bigger trees. And by bedding in, what I mean is that trying to make it look like the trees have not just been plopped down, but have actually just kind of grown around the rocks. And then you can also improve that look by adding other types of plants, such as these smaller flowers and bushes from the, I think this is the tropical set. Tropical set has a lot of like good small plants that you can put down just to help with that general look. It's all about just taking your time, really. Obviously, if you're using mods, you can get stuff really close together. Around things like water sources, I would stick to using smaller bushes, smaller trees, lots of tropical plants, that sort of thing. I would also make use of things like the banana palms, and I would also use these sorts of the spiky bushes, also work quite well as water plants. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in all the vegetation that I want to have in this area, and I'll be back in a second to show you what I've done. So there we have it. The trees and bushes are in, the hardcore is in. I'm just going to go around and show some folks some things I've done. So mixing and matching types of trees. So we've got some of the taiga and alpine trees in here, because in the UK we do get a wide range of tree types growing. They're not all sort of oaks and sycamores and that sort of thing. Again, keeping up with the utilizing the orange and red trees from the Philadelphia set to give some color to spruce up that otherwise sort of green effect. Now, this is a tip for specifically people using mods. Sink some types of tree into the ground to create bushes using Kaidenix Move It mod. So you can see here, these are the banana palms. And all I've done is I've sunk them into the ground a bit to create a sort of small bush, which can be really helpful to design and decorate areas around rocks, because we are a bit lacking in like types of like ferny, bushy sort of bushes and shrubs, that sort of thing. If you're not using mods, I suggest you use plenty of the small bush types and just replace them with that, basically. So a couple of other things we need to do before we pick a species here. We need to improve the water, because this looks a little flat. So I'm going to put down sand in the water to make it look a little less flat. And then we are also going to just add a little darker rock. Not too much, just a few steps. There we go. And that gives a nice artificial depth look to the water. I'm also going to make this area a little more sandy. So our dinosaurs have a kind of beach, as it were. Now, around the areas where we have the trees, we're going to utilize the tree brushes to put down additional foliage. Ginkgos always work really well, as you can see there. Plenty of ginkgos have just been popped down. But I'm also going to use the flowers Flowers are nice, I think, on this particular map especially. Now this is basically going to be providing food for our animals that we put in here, and they are going to be herbivores in this particular enclosure. And they're going to be herbivores because, to me, the first animal you put in your park, unless you're going with a particular theme, like it's an all carnivore park or an all hybrid park or something like that, the first animal you want to have is something herbivorous and something not over the top. I'm going to put some leafy climbers in the middle. Now, the final thing to do is I want to add pleasure paths. Now, I know that sounds perverse, but hear me out. So pleasure paths is the routes that animals and humans tend to take to get to places over things like grassy verges. If you've ever seen like obvious sort of routes where people have been walking over grass or verges, that sort of thing, that is called a pleasure path. And basically adding it to your enclosures, usually with something like a dirt brush, just lightly, just to make it look like things have been walking around. It just really helps to make it look like the dinosaurs have been living here for a while and have kind of eroded their own paths around the enclosure. It can also help with you figuring out where you want to put particular types of plants and vegetation, because obviously you put them where the pleasure paths aren't. There we go. Obviously there is a lot more that you can do with enclosures. You can decorate them with additional trees and additional decoration types, and we'll do that for other types of enclosure in this series. For this one we're going to go with something relatively simple. So there is the enclosure basically constructed with the hardcore, the bigger trees, smaller trees, bushes, decoration. We've got the pleasure paths in, we've got the food for the herbivores, and we've added texture to the water to make it look deeper and make it look a little interesting. So the next important step is to decide on your dinosaur. So picking a dinosaur can be something that takes a long time to decide. I would always suggest that once you have constructed your enclosure, you don't actually go and pick the dinosaur from the hatchery. I would suggest you save and come to the species viewer and actually have a look at all of the species that you have to choose from and figure out the sort of thing that you want to have. Now I have a lot of species, 155 because of mods and such, but we're not going to pick a modded animal, we're going to pick something a bit more standard. Now, picking the right sort of animal for your enclosure can help make the park feel more realistic. For that sort of enclosure in that octagon that we've just designed, you know, people would say, oh, well, it's the first dinosaur, you should make it big, like Brachiosaurus. But it doesn't really suit that sort of style of enclosure. I'm thinking we want something mid-sized, something like Nodosaurus or a Stegosaurid of some description, something along those lines. So let's have a look through here. What shall we go with? I mean, Nodosaurus doesn't get a lot of love, I feel. So let's go with Nodosaurus. And then once you've decided on the animal, decide on skins and how you're going to decide on your skins. Are you going to have skins that match the environment? Are you going to base the skins of real life animals? Or are you going to go with sexual dimorphism? And we're going to do sexual dimorphism for this particular park. I'd like to have sexual dimorphism in all of our animals. So for our male and female, we're going to want a separate skin that looks similar, but one for the male which will be quite bright and one for the female which won't be. Now the patterns on Nodosaurus basically kind of change the armor, but also add sort of decorations to the horns. So what I want to do is find one that can sort of suit a male in sort of a display pattern. But I also want a main body color that's not too sort of strange. So I think something like maybe the grey and the black. And so if we give the black a pattern, so say we give the males Svalbard with Porkrana, and then what we can do is we can give the females wow, that works quite well actually. We can give the females Yukon River and Porkrana, and basically you sort of have a similar skin. I mean, you could remove the pattern entirely, but I like the fact that they do also still have a remnant of the pattern, but Svalbard, the pattern is just more distinct and bright. Okay, so actually we're going to keep Svalbard and Porkrana for the male, but then the female we're just going to have as Yukon River. We're going to make the difference in colours really distinctive, which I think helps with the Ankylosaurs because their patterns and skins are kind of poor, really. So that's going to be our female, and we're going to then have our male. So let's go back to the park and get these bred and into the enclosure. Now back to the game, and there is something we should discuss which I haven't actually mentioned, and that is when you are constructing your park, it's useful to have sort of an area you just cut off from the rest of the park to breed your dinosaurs at, basically just a simple entrance structure and a hatchery. I think this area at the back here, maybe we need to find somewhere we could actually, here kind of makes sense. Obviously you can make your hatcheries part of the park if you wish. I tend to not do that because I like to make the park look as natural as possible, take my inspiration from royal parks. When it comes to connecting them up, you can connect them up in however you like. I'm just doing this quickly just so that we can get it done. So looking back at our enclosure, we need to decide how many Nodosaurs we're going to have in here and sort of what mixture of male and female we're going to do. An enclosure this big, I think we could probably get away with 5 Nodosaurs in here. And we're going to go with 2 male and 3 female, because I think that's a good mix to have. So let's get these created. Obviously you can do whatever sort of gene modifications and that sort of thing you like at this point. I tend not to mess around with that system. I don't think it's a particularly interesting one. There we go. And then we're going to release via airlift and plonk them down. I'm going to whack this on fast forward to get it done quicker. And what we're going to do is we're going to wait and have a look at see sort of just how busy the enclosure looks before we decide whether we want any other additional animals in here or whether these 5 Nodosaurs will be sufficient. Honestly, I think these 5 Nodosaurs might be fine as they are. Although that being said, they are relatively small, aren't they? So we could get away with having some additional animals in here. So there we go, there's our 5 Nodosaurs in their enclosure. Our male Nodosaurs with the very distinct patterns and coloration. And the females that are a lot plainer, but still sort of a similar sort of colour. Now having a look in here, I mean, the Nodosaurs are not particularly big, so they don't take up much room. So I think we could get away with having a second species in here. Now, if you're doing a mixed species enclosure, something that I would suggest is that you make the species very different to one another so they stand out more. So if you have an animal that walks around on 4 legs, a herbivore that's, quadrupedal. Pick a bipedal species to live alongside them. Or if you're gonna do, multiple quadrupedal type animals, for example, make them from different family groups. So have ceratopsians live alongside stegosaurs, or have ankylosaurs live alongside ceratopsians. Make them visually very distinct from one another. Just, it adds interest. Don't ever, I think, when you do something like you have multiple types of hadrosaur types living together, like, oh, I'll have Olorotitan and Parasaurolophus and Centaur living together, or I'll have Styracosaurus and Triceratops and Torosaurus living together. They don't tend to stand out too much, and I think it creates a very boring enclosure, especially since animals of similar groups tend to have relatively similar skin colors and patterns sometimes. So making them part of different groups can really help with that. So Nodosaurus here, a relatively small quadrupedal. I'm thinking I'm going to combine it with a bipedal animal. And again, think about how big you're going to want this. I don't think we want a bipedal animal that's too huge. It's still got to be sort of relatively safe for this sort of style of enclosure. So I'm thinking a relatively small-ish bipedal animal. So let's go back to the species viewer and have a look. So back in the species viewer, and really we're looking at smaller bipedal animals. So something like Archaeornithomimus, Struthio, Dryosaurus, Gallimimus, Homalocephaly, they're all reasonably good picks, I think. Muttaburrasaurus is an interesting one because Muttaburra is bipedal, but also not particularly huge, so that could work alongside Nodosaurus reasonably well. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to go with the classic Struthiomimus, and I love Struthio because its skins and patterns work really, really well. So again, we're going to pick our male and females. Now, I want to pick male and female skins that are very distinctly different to the Nodosaurus's colors. So I'm thinking something that's either green or yellow in coloration. Amazon rainforest and Sonoran desert work quite well, or Death Valley in Amazon. Actually, Sonoran desert and Death Valley work quite good together. Okay, we're going to go with Sonoran desert and Death Valley. And Sonoran desert is going to be our male skin, and I'm going to pick a pattern that sort of stands out quite nicely. I think the white works quite well on this guy, actually. Yeah, we're going to go with the white. The white's going to stand out quite nicely in the enclosure. So that's going to be our male. And then the female, we're going to make a little less bright. So the female, we're still going to have white stripes on the female, but we're going to use the Death Valley coloration to be the sexual dimorphism aspect. So back in the park, and again, we're thinking about how many Struthiomimus we're going to want to actually put in here. I think maybe a flock of 6 would be sufficient. And we're going to go with a single male and 5 females. Now, while they're moving them in, I think it's worth putting in just a few of the additional routes that we're going to have paving and stuff take from here. Obviously, we're going to have 2 routes directly off. One for the tour, one for the path going to the bigger areas of the park. And we're going to make sure they're on the points of the octagon there. The hotel area will obviously come off of here. And then we're going to have a bridge over this river. We're also probably going to have more amenities over here. So I'm just going to put A for amenity there. And we're probably going to also have something similar there, so A for amenity here. This will probably keep as vegetation, so I'm just going to crosshatch it. Nothing too big though, because I want them to still get the view. And we're probably going to have some vegetation there to demarcate the gap between the hotel and the other area of the park. Same for over here, so that's going to be vegetation there. So the hotel will be in this little area here, and if we do it well, we might be able to get the hotel to overlook the tour. So there is our studios, and again there is our male Struthi, and then you have our females that are a lot lighter in color, that don't stand out as much. And again, I think they make a good accompaniment to the lower Nodosaurs. The enclosure doesn't feel too overly crowded. It's quite open and bright, which is good for people to, be looking down into it. Something that you could also do at this point is think about dinosaur enrichment. Adding dinosaur enrichment is very difficult in this game because we don't really have that much to choose from. But that could be anything such as adding pretend water feature fountains in to give them something to pretend drink from. It could be things like adding fire obelisks or lighting to various areas of the enclosure. It could be mod related things such as roofing or that sort of thing. For me, for enrichment for these guys, I'm just going to go with something relatively standard. We're going to put in some logs actually, because I think this park could do with a few logs. Now logs obviously take away vegetation, so be careful where you're going to be placing them. But a few logs scattered here and there, I think, can really add to the feel of an enclosure. And again, if you're using mods, and this is a tip for mod users, what you can do with these logs is actually sink them down into the ground a bit to make them look like they've been there for a long time. You can also do other stuff if you're using mods, such as burying them at weird angles. Just helps to improve the look. I'm also going to add a pretend drinking fountain for them. And I'm going to make use of this... I think I'm going to make use of this low one. And we're going to put it... Where shall we put it? I think we'll put it at the back of the enclosure, because it makes sense to have something back here. There we go. So they've got like a pretend drinking fountain to drink from. It adds some movement into the enclosure. Something just to make it look a bit more distinctive. You can also obviously bed this in with planting and trees and such around the outside. Something I'll probably do off video. But yeah, I think this sort of style of enclosure, this sort of type of enclosure is good for an initial enclosure for the park. Obviously, if you were going to put a carnivore of some variety in here, I would suggest you make the internal fence an actual proper fence type, not the invisible one, but something like the light or medium fencing. And you'd probably also want to then include some alternative form of viewing. Something that's worth remembering is that without viewing galleries, this enclosure is kind of a pretend one. Guests will not come and look at this unless you have a viewing structure somewhere. So for something like this, you could put in a viewing dome or the viewing log. Both of those would work very well. You could also just put a viewing tower somewhere to overlook it, and that's probably what I'll do. I'll probably have a viewing tower over here that's going to overlook this enclosure, just to make sure that, you know, it applies to the guests. And there we go, a very simple enclosure. Obviously, designing the rest of this area will be another video in itself. This enclosure one, I just wanted to, you know, take some time to go over designing an enclosure with you guys, because I think people might have trouble creating more interesting sort of styles of enclosure. I mean, for this particular one, I'm actually gonna, before I finish the video, I'm gonna just do one small thing which I think people don't do enough. I'm gonna add some additional height to the enclosure. Not much, it doesn't have to be huge, just some additional height. Because it's a little flat, but if you just add like a little mound, especially if you've got like food or trees or something on here, it's in the middle of the pleasure paths, but this is, you know, where you've got plenty of food, and that just helps to give the enclosure some texture, basically. Too many people design their enclosures to be like 100% flat, and that just doesn't look good. It looks very artificial, very fake. You want to give the enclosure some terrain height differencing, in the same way that you would when we were doing the area over here. We don't want this whole zone to be flat. We're going to have an upper section and a lower section. Same with the tour, we're not going to have this 100% flat. We're going to have some artificial terrain heights in here. So do the same with your enclosures. Don't make them totally flat. Give them some little terrain height, just to make them look interesting. So next video, we're going to tackle creating the bridge, and we're also going to tackle the sort of outer areas here. Between that video and this one, I'm probably going to take some time to do some basic sort of preparation work for that. So you'll probably come back in next video, we'll see that we have sort of the path. I'll probably put the amenities in, because you don't need to see me put amenities in again. I already went over amenities with that one. So you'll probably see that we'll have amenities and more plazas put in, and we'll tackle the construction of the bridge and how to do something like a bridge in your park over rivers. And we're also going to look at probably the hotel zone, and then yeah, we'll go from there. Don't forget to like the video and comment with anything you might want help with in future videos that I can tackle, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're new here for more content, not just on Jurassic World Evolution but on all the other games we play, because that really does help us, and you know, we're doing this for you guys to watch. So if you could give us a subscribe, that would be very much appreciated. But until next time, folks, stay safe and goodbye.